So back in 2018, the South African government did something that, on paper, sounds pretty minor. It raised a national tax by just 1%. But that single percentage point kicked off a massive nationwide firestorm of debate and public anger. How can such a tiny change cause such a huge uproar? Well, let's dive in, because this story isn't just about a number. It's about what and who that 1% was really paying for.
Okay, so to really get this, we need a little context. Take a look at this timeline. From 1993, right on the edge of a new democracy, all the way through to 2017, the value-added tax, or VAT, it never changed. For a quarter of a century, it sat at 14%. It was just a given, a predictable part of life. And then, in 2018, that long freeze was finally broken.
And that brings us right back to the big question, right? On the surface, it's just a small tweak to help run the country. So why did it feel like such a massive betrayal to so many people?
All right, let's unpack this. To figure it out, we have to start with the official reason. What was the government's side of the story?
The official line was pretty simple. The country had a financial hole, kind of like a leaky bucket that needed patching up. But here's the thing. As we're about to see, that official leak, it was just a tiny drip compared to the absolute flood of cash draining out from somewhere else.
And here's the number they put on the table, a revenue gap of 48.2 billion rand. So the 1% VAT hike was sold as this necessary, maybe a little painful, step to close this specific gap and keep public services going. A straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. Right? We'll hold that thought.
There's this old saying, and it is the perfect pivot point for our story. Because 48 billion rand is definitely real money, but it was about to look like pocket change next to the other numbers that were flying around.
And this is the real core of the anger. The public outcry wasn't really about that 48.2 billion rand. It was this growing, gut suspicion that ordinary citizens were being told to patch a tiny hole with their own money while everyone ignored these massive, gaping wounds in the national finances caused by two huge problems.
The first problem goes by a name that became, well, infamous in South Africa: state capture. And look, this isn't just about a few dodgy deals or some individual bribery. We're talking about something systemic. It's when private interests get so powerful they're basically steering the ship of state for their own profit, messing with contracts, appointments, even national policy.
And this is where the official story just completely falls apart. The estimated cost of state capture, around 1.5 trillion rand. I mean, just let that number sink in for a second. Compare that to the 48 billion rand budget gap. The VAT hike was meant to fill a hole that was less than 4% of the money estimated to have been lost to systemic corruption.
But wait, there's more. The second huge leak is something called Illicit Financial Flows, or IFF. Basically, this is all the money that's illegally moved out of the country. We're talking about corporate tax dodging, faking invoices, all these criminal schemes designed to shift profits out of South Africa and away from the tax authorities.
And the numbers here are just as jaw-dropping. South Africa loses an estimated $3.5 billion to these flows every single year. That's nearly double the budget gap the VAT hike was supposed to fix, happening over and over and over again. So the bucket wasn't just leaking, right? It was being actively emptied.
So with all this money gone, where does that leave the country? These astronomical numbers aren't just figures on a page. When you lose trillions to corruption and billions flee the country illegally, somebody has to foot the bill. And that whole debate over the VAT hike? It was really a debate about who that somebody was going to be.
Now, to soften the blow, the government did increase social grants. But just look at this comparison from back in 2018. The food poverty line, and that's the absolute bare minimum you need to not go hungry, was 531 rand a month. The child support grant, even after they increased it, was only 400 rand. It was still over 130 rand below the minimum for survival.
And the experts saw this clear as day. The government argued that zero-rated basic foods, things with no VAT, would protect the poor. But as this analysis from the University of Pretoria pointed out, the whole idea that this was a sufficient cushion against price hikes, well, it was just plain false for households already struggling to get by.
This research really put the hard data behind what so many people were feeling on the ground, that this tax hike was pushing the most vulnerable people even deeper into poverty, forcing them to pay for a crisis created by the powerful and the corrupt. You know, this whole situation forces you to ask a pretty fundamental question about what taxes are actually for. Is it to pay for services, or is it to pay for mistakes and corruption? A quick comparison makes the difference crystal clear.
Let's take a look at a place like Denmark. Their VAT rate is a whopping 25%, but in return, citizens get free, high-quality healthcare and education for everybody. There's a really clear social contract. You pay high taxes, you get exceptional universal services back. In South Africa in 2018, the argument was totally different. Citizens were being asked to pay more, not for new or better services, but to cover a deficit created by state capture and illicit flows. It was a tax to pay for losses, not for gains.
And that right there, that brings us to the real heart of the issue. The national outcry wasn't ultimately about a fiscal deficit. It was about a trust deficit.
So in the end, when you boil it all down, the story of the 1% was never really about the 1%. It was the final straw. It was the moment the public was asked to pay for a crisis they didn't create, a crisis of state capture and illicit flows that had already cost them trillions. This wasn't a debate about taxes, it was a reckoning over a broken social contract.
And this leaves us with a final, powerful question. When a state's finances are shattered by corruption and mismanagement, when the trust between citizens and their government is broken, who is ultimately asked to pick up the pieces and pay the price?